महादेव शम्भो शिव शङ्कर महादेव शम्भो शिव शङ्कर.
And welcome to the Prabha Khaitan Foundation Zubaan Translation Conclave. We have gathered here to celebrate and deliberate over many ideas that have been set into motion about the PKF Zubaan Translation Grant Program. That's quite a mouthful. The grant program was premised on the idea of encouraging bibliodiversity through the translation of feminist titles into as many Indian languages as possible. We wanted to support translators across languages, get decent remuneration and recognition. We also wanted Zubaan's excellent list to find new readers across the country so that more people think about issues of patriarchy, equity, and justice. We also wanted to build relationships with publishers in Indian languages who are growing their lists for a whole new generation of readers. While we had a sense of how many of them were going to be interested in feminist titles, what has been very heartening to see is the range of books that they picked up as part of the grant program. While books on the anti-caste struggle have been picked up by many publishers, we've also seen a great deal of interest in books from the Northeast, fiction, children's books, and biographies. They've all found takers, and it's been great to see the level of interest that has been generated in different languages for titles that we didn't expect to go into different parts of the country. It's not been a one-way street at all. We've been very impressed with the work that small independent publishers have been doing. They are passionate, and most of them publish because they have a deep belief in the power of books to spread new ideas. We've also had the good fortune to work with big established publishers who want to diversify their lists. It's not been an easy journey always. There have been impediments such as finding translators who can engage with the deeply feminist language, because that requires testing the elasticity of each Zubaan to accommodate new ways of being and expression. We managed to support 46 titles in 10 languages as a part of the program until now. Some of them are published and out in the new markets, while others will be out during the course of the year. We've also had the pleasure of many interesting conversations with translators, publishers, and feminists at such events. This is our concluding event, and it promises to give us much food for thought with such an eminent lineup of academics, translators, and publishers. I'd now like to invite Anindita from the Prabha Khaitan Foundation to speak about their experience of the program. Come, Anindita.
Good morning, everybody. Like Manisha ji said, it's really nice to see all of you attending this program on a weekday and early in the morning. Thank you so much for making it. As Manisha ji was saying, it's been a very nice, fruitful, and very engaging journey with Prabha Khaitan Foundation and Zubaan Translation Series. So, I mean, this is just amazing. When we started, we never knew that this is going to come up in this big way. But yes, thanks to Zubaan and thanks to all the publishers, all the authors, and the translators, it has taken a big shape. Collaboration to bridge the geographical boundaries and bring together literature lovers under one fold defines the true essence of translation. Regional literary creations might be specific to a particular area, but what strikes a common chord is the exploration of life, gender, and society. Literary creations are fingerprints of the cultural diversities of a nation. In the mission to encourage literature and widen its reach, Prabha Khaitan Foundation charted the path of a unique collaboration with Zubaan, the largest feminist publishing house focusing on translating literature of India back in 2021. Year 2021 marked a milestone as two organizations planned to synergize their efforts and focus on a novel project, the Zubaan Prabha Khaitan Foundation Translation Project, a new collaboration with PKF, Urvashi ji, and Manisha ji, of course. The seed of this project was sown much before with the translation of late Dr. Prabha Khaitan's powerful autobiography, Anya Se Ananya, into English translator Ira Pandey. Formal launch of the project took place in May 2022 at India International Center, New Delhi, and the cherished collaboration has continued since then. In July 2023, we witnessed an enriching discussion on translation as exploration at India International Center, New Delhi. And today, once again, we have come together to nurture our bond and common love for books in Hyderabad. In fact, in Delhi last year, I think Rita ji was there. Thank you for coming once again here. Indeed, a glad moment for Prabha Khaitan Foundation and Zubaan to celebrate Translation Conclave, Feminist Pollinations across our cultural landscape. A day-long event to commemorate the cherished partnership in bringing feminist literature published in English into the Indian languages through a series of translation grants. I think a big round of applause for the fruitful association. And right now, as Manisha ji has mentioned, that we've been successful in publishing 46 novels in 10 Indian languages, right? Today at this conclave, eminent writers, publishers, translators will bring into discussions women's work across the vast literary landscapes of India and importance of translation in blurring the geographical divide. Let us hear a bit about Prabha Khaitan Foundation. It's a Kolkata-based non-profit trust. It is established by eminent literature, cultural and social activist late Dr. Prabha Khaitan back in 1980s. Pursuits and projects undertaken for promotion of literature, culture, heritage, women empowerment, and social welfare are the hallmarks of the foundation. The foundation believes all creative expressions of art forms are platforms to connect to niche audience, communicate ideas, and create a cultural capital. The foundation has charted a resplendent journey of 4 decades in curating landmark events and activities in more than 50 cities in India and overseas. The foundation enjoys the noble patronage of Sri Cement Limited as their CSR initiative, support and cooperation of distinguished associates like Zubaan, partners, collaborators, and Ehsaas Women of India have helped the foundation successfully curate book launches, authors' meets, cultural programs, literature fests, and boutique festivals, and many more. It has been a fantastic journey with Zubaan, Prabha Khaitan Foundation, and Zubaan all this while, and I'm sure we will take this forward soon. Can I request Urvashi ji to come and say a few words?
No more speech for you, but I thought that I would just welcome all of you. It's lovely to have you here, and I thought I would tell you a little bit about the backstory, which Anindita referred to. So this foundation, the Prabha Khaitan Foundation that we work with, is a foundation that came into Zubaan's life when Prabha Khaitan's son, Sandeep Bhutoria, who now heads the foundation, asked us if we were willing to publish her autobiography translated into English from the Hindi original in which it was written. And I had known of this autobiography because when it was released in Hindi in Delhi, Prabha Khaitan was still alive. And when she came to Delhi, there was an uproar about this autobiography. And the uproar was because it is an account of a very frank, very open account of a woman who falls in love with a married man. And then she lives her life with this married man who continues, like many married men who have relationships with other women, to have a whole family which he lives with, and he continues a relationship with this woman. And she writes in completely frank terms about falling in love and about the whole arc from love to almost hatred at the end, or to a kind of revulsion at the man who does not value her for what she is. And she decides halfway through this long relationship, where he, an extremely well-known eye doctor in Kolkata, and with a very, very successful eye practice, travels the world with Prabha Khaitan but ignores her whenever she's anywhere. And she finds herself one day in the United States, I think in New York or someplace, out on the road all alone, and she buys a handbag. And then she is so much in despair that she kind of falls by the side of the road and chucks her handbag away. And a black woman walks up to her and says to her, "What's wrong?" And then they start talking, and there is a kind of empathy and solidarity, and it is that step that helps Prabha Khaitan to stand up on her own feet. And she then comes back to India, determined to do her own thing. She sets up beauty clinics. I don't know if any of you remember, because this was in the time when I was young, these clinics called Silhouette, which had the silhouette of a woman like that. And she starts to earn her own money through that and to subsidize the doctor and his family. And then she discovers and starts to abhor the faith women have in a fake beauty standard. And she keeps saying all these women are sort of struggling to make themselves look beautiful, but for what? And what does beauty comprise? So she starts questioning her own thing, and she decides to ditch that, and she ditches it, and then she becomes involved with the leather industry, going back to that bag that she had. And she starts to learn how to make leather bags, how to make leather products. She goes to Kanpur, she works in the tanneries, she works on the shop floor, and finally she becomes a hugely successful woman in the leather industry and becomes the first woman to head the Calcutta Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Now, when this woman came to Delhi to launch her book, the entirely male literary world of Hindi writing in Delhi was very, very upset, and one of the best known writers there by the name of Rajendra Yadav wrote a piece in a magazine called Hans. That piece was called Rona Sona Ek Sundar Dushman Ke Saath. That you know what it means. And there was a big uproar because she was frank about love and sexuality and sex in the book. So for us, when the Prabha Khaitan Foundation approached us with the idea of translating the book, this was the perfect thing for Zubaan, and we were delighted to do it, and that was the beginning of a long association. So I just wanted to tell you that story, welcome you all, and we will get started with V. Geeta's keynote address. Are you going to introduce Geeta? Am I introducing her? So I don't know how to introduce Geeta, because she's a woman of many parts, except to say that she's a very old friend of mine. So that's enough. We were together for a long time in the women's movement, and we have many memories we keep sharing of women's conferences where we all slept in the same room, where we cleaned the bathrooms and so on. But Geeta is much more than that. She's a stunning publisher. She is the director, co-director of Tara Books, which is a wonderful publisher based in Chennai. Geeta is also an activist, a writer, a researcher, an academic, and is involved in all forms of cultural production. And I don't know what more to say about her. So Geeta will come and do the keynote, and I'm sure it'll be pretty stunning. So Geeta, welcome.
I'm delighted to be here for many reasons. For one, it brings me back to my first love, which is literature and reading. And secondly, it's wonderful to be part of Zubaan's initiative, having followed the fortunes of Indian feminist publishing since the time of Kali for women, and as a publisher, knowing of the travails of publishing in India and surviving as an independent publisher, it gives me great pleasure to be part of something that has extended the world of publishing in so many different directions and in many languages. The second reason is, while preparing for this talk, I went back and read the work of people that I have been reading for a while and who have written on translation, and two of them are here, Devika and Rita. And there are others who have extended the scope of linguistic communication through music and performance. There's Sarasi here, whose work I've known again for many, many years. So in that sense, for me, this is also, whatever I'm going to present is part of this collective context within which many of us learn. It's not a lineage in the sense you trace it from an ancestor. It's really part of conversations and things we learn from each other. So I'm glad to be doing this. So I want to start by saying that feminists have always had to translate. their politics, practice, and embodied existence. For their claims to equality and justice, as Gabriela Dietrich put it many years ago, constituted, to quote Gabriela, a new thing on earth. This newness attracted censure, rejection, and obdurate and sometimes violent hatred. Family members were astounded when we brought our feminisms home. Old-time friends wondered if we were not being too shrill and loud, and intimate partners were alarmed. We seldom speak of how we became feminists in an existential sense. We've tried to account for it in historical and sociological ways, but each of our journeys has been embedded in our bodies, in the languages that we use to communicate feminism. In any case, to render ourselves legible, we've had to find words, remake old words, learn from other languages. And this is important because we seldom see ourselves doing that in a conscious way. For Tamil, I can give you an example. The word for chastity in Tamil is karpu, as some of you might know. And sexual assault or rape is sort of marked as a destruction of chastity. So when we were looking for other ways of talking about it, surprise, surprise, from Tamil Nadu, we chose the Hindi word balatkar. And we termed it Paliyal Vanmurai or Paliyal Balatkaram. So in a sense, the longer history of our languages also have to be put aside when we think of how are we going to make words mean for ourselves. So Tamil, which has always claimed for itself an exceptional status when compared to Sanskrit or Hindi, we have not been averse to opening up our linguistic universes to words from other languages in the context of feminist communication, and I think that's important. Because what happens also is, while we try and choose a phrase or a word to describe what we wanted to say, like say take domestic violence, which is such an anodyne term for something that is so specific in the way we've come to terms with it. In Tamil, we use the term Kudumba Vanmurai. Kudumbam, as you all know, is family. And interestingly, the phrase then becomes, when you start using it, the word for family, Kudumbam, becomes both a place referent as well as an adjective. Because it refers to a specific kind of violence and one that is likely to be misrecognized. Because the moment you go to a police station and ask for a case to be filed under 498A, especially in the late 80s and 1990s, and talk about family violence, the immediate response, and I'm sure many of you will identify with this, but that's only for your own good. You've been beaten for your own good. So this whole thing of how do you translate while bringing a separate sense of what you wish to communicate to the word domestic, this is something that we've never been completely successful with. So our wrestling with words has been quite complex. And as far as domestic violence is concerned, it has not really done, at least in Tamil, it could not capture those everyday acts of bullying, humiliation, and rejection that women experience. And so women resort to diverse strategies to amplify the meaning of what they mean. So where they are not heeded and instead then they are belittled, they draw upon a justice claim that might appear indisputable. So in our experience as so-called case workers with women who face violence, we found that the one term that acquired legibility in the eyes of the state, whether it's the police thana or the family court, was of course to make your story out to be a dowry-related crime, when perhaps dowry was not the most important issue in that context. Another thing was to also talk of how you understand the role of violence in ensuring family stability. All you're saying is that you protest against the misuse of violence, which means that you then say, sometimes I deserve to be punished, so that you don't come across as arbitrary, that you actually want people to take note of the fact that this is an arbitrary act of violence, separate from those disciplinary means that are used to bring a woman back to her good senses. So this is how we had to play with language many a time. And interestingly enough, some of the women that we worked with would use the English word torture to describe what they were enduring. While there exists a Tamil word for torture, they would use the English word torture, which we found fascinating because I think it conveyed the weight of what they were trying to say. Another approach was to frame their experiences, citing analogous situations from popular culture. You know, madam, in that film, Khushbu says this, or in this film, so-and-so says this. So you see how our experiences really sort of teeter on the edge of language. and you're constantly translating. Even if you're using the same language, you're translating from one register to another, from one kind of experience to a more public kind of experience. And as case workers, we were also translating. Because while we had to write reports or file affidavits or summarize a medical report, very early on we learned that in order to be read, whether by the sub-inspector in a station or by a counselor at the legal aid board, the state legal aid board, which assists indigent petitioners, you have to write it in such a way that the reader immediately gets it. And readers don't read reports, they eye scan the report. So certain phrases have to jump out. So how do you write and do justice to what people have to say while at the same time retaining attention? And of course, none of this guarantee that we would actually be heard. I remember this one time where an assistant commissioner of police scolded me for supporting a woman who he said was of loose models. So in a way, you're really trapped in what you try to do, and it's not very easy to exit from that situation. And things get complicated when the languages we speak, whatever languages we are used to speaking, are not literally audible. So Pratiksha Bakshi, in her work on the law, has pointed to this very poignant story of a child witness, Noor Jahan, whose stepfather had assaulted her, being brought in front of the witness box, and how she, being a Muslim child, her Hindi becomes a context to point to her vagueness of understanding and ultimately to interrogate the veracity of her statements. So you find this constant conversation between the judge and the defense lawyer about her Hindi, which marks her as illegitimate almost in that Gujarati trial court. Equally, Pratiksha has pointed out to the bewilderment that the child experiences as the court moves between three languages, Hindi, Gujarati and English. And in this context, I also want to point out the difficulties that Dalit women face. Again, it's both linguistic and social, when they put forth accusations against dominant caste men and women in the context of what the law terms an atrocity. Firstly, they are not believed. Secondly, their words are twisted to mean that the woman in question had to endure what was done to her because either she or others associated with her had done wrong in the first place. This is what lawyers recognize as a counter-complaint. I mean, it's become so normalized that there's a term for it, that it's termed a counter-complaint. If a case is filed under the Prevention of Atrocities Act, immediately a counter-complaint follows. So you find that there is again this problem of communication and language. How do you speak so that you are heard and you're not stopped? So that you see. And thirdly, you have another situation, and I think Rupal Oza has written about it in her review of cases in Rajasthan, that families that stand by the victim in cases of the Atrocities Act are often coerced to withdraw cases in and through monetary negotiation. And then the petitioner, as a court scholar, finds herself facing a story in which she does not figure at all, in the way she would have liked to have narrated that story. So there are other speeches problems as well. For example, violent speech directed at Dalit men, because I think one of the important things about the Prevention of Atrocities Act, it's critically gendered. It talks about both gender and caste in very complex ways, unlike much of our other pieces of legislation. So there you see that speech is listed as a crime. Hate speech in terms of caste is listed as a crime. But when a group in Tamil Nadu, a Jesuit group, tried to compile all the first information reports that were filed in the southern districts during a certain time of violence against Dalits, they noted the extreme hatefulness of those speeches. And then you wonder where this linguistic register is not audible at other times. It is not audible in the popular media, it's not audible in cinema, but it exists. And some of it I'm just going to summarize because it's fairly hateful even if you don't know Tamil, and I find it very hard for me to repeat those things. But basically what the substance of it is, Dalit men who are found in an upper caste, dominant caste neighborhood are accused of being faggots and looking for possible lovers to seduce in the caste Hindu neighborhood. And this is described in very graphic terms. They are accused also of not being men enough, therefore, which is why their women seek out dominant caste lovers. So there's this really sort of very messy, hateful kind of manner in which Dalit men are also positioned in this universe. So these words, when uttered in Tamil, mark caste Hindu scorn and violence as necessary, as given, as something that can't be disputed. And in this case, it is the calm and flat letter of the law that translates them as crime. So you also have this tussle with the language of the law. Sometimes it does not capture enough. Sometimes it is absolutely necessary to mark something as a crime. So as feminists working with the law and also working in despair against the limits of the law, you find yourselves at a linguistic impasse sometimes, which is not simply about language in a straightforward sense. So this is something that, that also I wanted to sort of put in front here. The other thing also that has bothered me for a while, and this is something my friend Sharifa, who founded the Tamil Nadu Muslim Women's Jamaat, brought to my attention, the way we under-translate and over-translate the situation of Muslim women as feminists in our own groups. And Sharifa once said, in view and in her critique of how Muslim women become significant for the women's movement, and she said it's either in the context of communal violence or in discussions to do with the Uniform Civil Code. So her question to us was, why don't you consider me as an equal partner in discussions to do with contraception, domestic violence, employment and labor issues? Because as far as I understand it, she said, and this was in response to the Sachar Committee report and its findings, Muslim women are both developmental subjects as well as subjects to do with community customs and control and the state. So you can't just bracket our existence in relationship to the state and ignore us the way we lead our lives in an everyday sense, sometimes much like the rest of you, sometimes in ways that are distinctive to us. But to mark us only as subjects of debates to do with communal violence or with the Uniform Civil Code means that you have not come to terms with the messiness of our existence. And I think that's a very profound critique also of translation. What do you choose to render legible about Muslim women? And what do you think is not important? And so I've begun with these instances of how as feminists we translate for the world around us, even as we translate the world to others, especially those parts of the worlds that we inhabit, which are not considered worthy of attention, which are not valued for what they have to tell us about intimate and social universes, or about what everyone loftily calls the human condition. None of these things matter if they are based on these kinds of experiences. First of all, experience as a category, and here Rita has written about it with great eloquence in her book, Uneasy Translations, is seldom recognized to have with that epistemological strength that it should be recognized. And women's experiences are probably not even valorized in any meaningful way. So it is in this sense, to me, it seems that translation itself is a feminist mandate. We have no choice but to translate. And I just want to expand on this in a little bit, not only in terms of the kinds of work we do, trying to bring worlds together that are seldom seen as having to be in conversation, but also because, and many of us will remember this, back in the 70s, one of the charges that feminism had to face was with feminism being an import from the West. And I remember all of us rushing to defend ourselves, saying, no, it's not like that. Kamala Bhasin, in fact, wrote a pamphlet to communicate, no, we are ourselves and we are not sort of imitating anybody. So that whole legitimacy of your enterprise, your politics is called into question in a way that marks it as alien. And so today we are told something is alien, we jump up and we get angry. But that accusation has a long genealogy as far as feminists are concerned. So, and in that context, you have to try and make sense of how do you communicate that you're here and you're saying things from here. And from its very early days, feminist writing has tried to do that in some ways, translating in complex ways. And I think Devika has this very fine essay. Devika, I think, is the 2008 essay, on translation, where she talks of how we are not really sort of copies of the original. Whatever it is, we have come to this through a very complex and hybrid process. We learn, we pick up things, and we also resituate them and make them work for ourselves in our local histories and in our local context. So I think this feminism being, translation being a feminist mandate is something that we've all lived through also in our everyday lives, in our professional lives, and we're all moving between languages. And I would like to spend a couple of minutes talking of my own interest in this personally. And anyone who's seen me in national conferences will recognize this. The moment a Hindi speech continues for 20 minutes without time left for translation, mine would be the first hand to go up, saying Hindi is not our language, please give us time to translate. And I think because of the growing presence of Southern Indian participants in these conferences, we developed an elaborate culture of translation. But at the same time, coming back home to Tamil Nadu, where Tamil is seen as so exceptional that it has nothing to learn from anybody, you find yourself also saying that, look, I'm sorry, but we haven't taught enough about this, whereas they have. And so you constantly find yourself walking this very rickety bridge, which might fall down any time, and you're not sure if you're doing justice to anything finally. And the words capture everything at all. But on the other hand, it has opened up this whole thing of how you stand in this medial space as a feminist, and how translation really is your genre in some ways. It's not just a way of doing things, it's also an epistemic activity, and it's very central to how we function as feminists. So I just want to next sort of flag off some issues that I think we might be interested in exploring together, while as feminists we translate in a more specific sense. We translate texts, or we translate books, or we translate speeches, or whatever it is that we want to translate. So I want to just talk about it in two ways. One is that the way women, while writing their experiences, have themselves created a range of narrative strategies to translate their sense of what it is that they would like to convey. So this, of course, we do in our everyday context, as I have pointed out, whether we go to a police station or a court. And recently, Niranthar, the Delhi-based feminist group, has started this column on their portal, the thirdeyeportal.in, they call it the case worker's diary, which is quite fascinating. They have picked up words that are used by so-called case workers working on family violence in Bundelkhand, and examined the many uses of a word in order to capture what they are doing, both the account of suffering, but also ways of dealing with it. So the one word that they've explored in detail is sanjota, and how it means 100 different things. This is all, it's so interesting how each generation comes to translation. So in this sense too, it's a kind of, you see that happening. But coming back to narratives, the most familiar narrative structure that we all know as feminists, and which we constantly work with, is of course the truth-telling autobiography. And here again, I must thank Rita for complicating my understanding of that autobiography. What is this autobiography all about? Because on the one hand, we also try and make claims for our movement from I to us. This is not just about the individual, it's about a community or us. This has been said about Bama's Karukku, for example. But on the other hand, what is this us? Is it the us that we want to recognize as belonging to feminism? Or as Rita says, talking about her mother's attempts to write her own story, it could well be of her satsang, the sensibility that emerges from being in a space feminists don't perhaps see as feminist enough. So it's a complicated genre to work with, but it's also very, very interesting because clearly there's a claim that we are making that pertains to our experiences, but also about the larger fraternal context where we want to situate ourselves. And as translators, how do we engage with this in terms of particular text? So I want to bring up something with Zubaan. I think many of us have opted to publish it. Sarasi has also finished it. We also made history, Women in the Ambedkarite Movement. And I want to call attention to the word also. So what does this also convey? It's a very interesting question. As a translator, if I were to do it, I would use a case ending in Tamil for the noun. Now, it's very intriguing if I do that, because in the context of what they were doing in Marathi, I think the writers were speaking in different constituencies. To the metropolitan feminist groups that had not seen anti-caste movements as having an interest in feminism, to Dalit men, including the Dalit Panthers, who have not seen the gender question as relevant, to feminist historiography that claims to be also, we are making history, the Telangana women in the Telangana armed struggle, but how come that this history does not contain a reference to caste? So it was speaking in multiple voices, it seems to me, the title itself. So how do we then translate a text like this? What is at stake for those of us who want to translate, starting from this very ironic and fraught title itself? How do we do that? And the interesting thing about this book is, it tries to present a world that is very familiar to the authors, and that familiarity comes through the unmarked ways in which they talk about leaders, writers, women who did this, who did that, from across what you might call the Ambedkarite landscape of Maharashtra. Vidarbha, Marathwada, and the Western Konkan. Now, this is a very familiar landscape if you know it. Places of villages, activist names, but there's great affection in the way these are being invoked from time to time. At the same time, when it's put into English, it becomes very new, because we have not heard these names anywhere in any historiography. So, as a translator, how do you retain that affectionate familiarity? Because it's like talking about each other in this room, no? Like I say, referring to Rita, but who is Rita to somebody who doesn't know the two of us? So, for the translator, then this poses a challenge. How do you then work with something like this? What do you do? Do you footnote? Do you write an introduction? Or do you translate in ways that makes this evident through the use of certain terms and so on? So I think the English text that announces this newness to the English reader is one thing. But if I'm going to put it in Tamil or Malayalam or Telugu or Kannada, I have to do much more. Because English is, as always, very arrogant. It's very convinced that once it's out in English, it constitutes a valid knowledge universe in itself. It doesn't need annotations. Whereas I think, this is something I've learned from my friend the late Sharmila Rege, where she always says fluency in English is always confused with accuracy of argument. It's something that I've learned from her. And therefore, the English text itself needs to be framed in certain ways, which it seldom is. So, for the translator, when you do it in your own linguistic context, this raises questions of how are we going to do it? How might we make this richer? So, and how do we prepare ourselves to hear things properly? Because you're also hearing words, no? I don't know about others, but I always say things aloud to myself when I translate. Does it sound like a word that I want to hear? And I've had some time with the stage, so I always, rely a lot on auditory keenness, how does a thing sound? And what in feminist thought and practice would enable us to do this better? I'm just opening up these questions. I don't have particular answers for anything. The other thing that you do also is that you read against the grain when you create a feminist text. And you do this a lot in history, where there is so much burden put on the feminist historian, because you don't want to just add and stir, as the editors of Recasting History put it many years ago. You want this to make a difference to the way you understand history. But you take something like Uma Chakravarti's classic text, Whatever Happened to the Vedic Dasi, the text that features in Kali's book, Recasting History, where she's talking about ancient India and this myth of the golden age, in the wonder that was India, and what is known to historians as the Altacarian paradigm of this golden age of Maitri, Gargeyi, and others, these fearless women and so on. And her question is, but what about the Dasi? And this, of course, is where we are scolded as being shrill. You're always whatabouting. Right? So what about the Dasi? And very interestingly, again, a question of translation is involved here, because she relies on the Pali canon rather than the Sanskrit canon. And that's a very important choice, to move from Sanskrit to Pali. And Uma has done that for the better part of her life as a historian of ancient India. Again, for the translator, say Tamil especially, this poses an interesting issue. Because Tamil has its own Shramana literature, Buddhist and Jain literature, like many of the South Indian languages do. And secondly, we have our own exceptional Sangam age also. So you're going to say Vedic age, we'll say Sangam age. And this for the translator is very, it's a challenge, because there is no gendering of the Sangam age. The only one gendering that was done was by this great Dalit critic Raj Gautaman, whose book Dark Interiors captures some of how this was done. But generally there's no gendering of the Dravidian model or the Sangam age. So in that sense, when you sort of work with a text like this, how do you then point to all that is at stake in making something knowledgeable, making something work for us as feminists? And this is true of oral history also in a very different way, because you're trying to reconstruct the same event from the point of view of those who were part of that event. So if, for example, many of you might be aware of this horrible Kulvenmani murders of 1968. Now there's a very richly layered and strong narrative put out by the CPM. And lots of text, lots of stuff. But in 2010, when some of us had visited the village for various reasons, and we were talking to 3 generations, 4 generations of women who were around, very interestingly, their stories were not so much about the party or about it being a red village, but of the work of the Gandhi and Sarvodaya movement in those regions. And we were very curious, why would they say that? The same family where the men were in the CPM. But why were these women going on about these Gandhian women? Because the Gandhian women had brought education to their homes. The Gandhian women had made sure their daughters went to school. So you had so oral history also then pushes you to sort of ask questions about how might I frame something if I don't have a sense of the relevance of this archive. And how do I bring the relevance of that archive into my translation practice? So that's another issue I wanted to flag. The third thing is another narrative form that feminists have drawn upon is fantastic storytelling. And I don't know what Sarasi is planning to do today, but usually when she performs her stories or talks about her work on gender and caste, she moves between the register of the real, which is the present, and storytelling, drawing from all kinds of oral narratives, which pushes it into another direction. She does that many times, and you see that in a lot of women's writing as well. Of course, Rokhaya does it, Rokhaya Hossain does it in a very classic sense, but you also have it in, say, Gogu Shamala's fiction, this movement between different linguistic universes. And here I want to just dwell very briefly on something which was so moving for some of us, Pratanya Dayapava's poem Love in the Time of Keralanji, which is a fantastic text in the word that we use the word fantastic in literature, because I think it tries to talk about what Keralanji was, the horrendous killing, murder and public spectacle that was enacted of killing of this Dalit family and the sexual assault of the women and all the horrid things that happened thereafter. And we had started a project wanting to translate Dalit women's poetry into Tamil, and of course, hubris, we wanted to translate from Telugu to Tamil, Kannada to Tamil, Marathi to Tamil. Now, Telugu to Tamil was not so difficult. There are still people in Tamil Nadu who speak both Telugu and Tamil. Kannada to Tamil also we managed. We worried people like Sarasi endlessly and got it done. Marathi was different because the people who speak Marathi in Tamil Nadu belong to a generation that nobody even recognizes as Marathi anymore. So we asked Chainika of the Forum Against Oppression of Women if she would work with Pradanya and do an English translation, which is then we sit with all three of us sit together and we do the Tamil. So for us this was a very dear and interesting project, but while then doing it in Tamil, I realized there were so many words that were crisscrossing here and we can't do justice to these words because Pradanya herself is translating. And I'm just going to read a small portion. Pash has said, and she's referring to the Punjabi poet Pash had said, the most dangerous is the dying of our dreams. Is this a lie, Bhima, that I speak your name? And in that moment bloom innumerable lotuses, skin smooth as marble? Is this a lie that I speak your name? And history comes alive like blood-filled menstruation. I mean, this floored us. How do you translate this? There's just so many words that come here and collide. The other thing was, how do you translate the intimacy of Bhima? When Ambedkar becomes Bhima, what do you do? But that Bhima lives on in everyday speech in Marathi. That Bhima is your neighbor. There's all these wonderful songs about Bhima waiting outside a school, Bhima doing this, Bhima doing that. But that Bhima doesn't work for all of us in that manner. So how do you translate that? And then, apart from this, she also does the unthinkable, which is she brings together the violence of the caste family and Keralanji, which is a very bold move. And I just want to read those lines as well. This sparkling white cloud that is running so free, he sat me on it, this beloved of mine, with eyes completely naked, where anyone can see love and Keralanji. Go back to your husband, Many voices rose from the lofty, secure rooftops of society. I refuse to become anyone's object. I refuse to make an object of anyone. Can a woman laugh from her intellect, heart and womb, loud, free and unpredictable? Sureka Botmange should be asked this once. I mean, this is a frightening passage for me. Because the kind of everyday familial violence it invokes and the horror that happened to Sureka, they are being brought together in this really uneasy conversation, which is frightening. But I think the way in which the poem unfolds, it challenges our understanding of storytelling itself and pushes us to really ask how do we then work with all of this. And lest we think that this is only the realm of people who rethink things and in a very deliberate kind of way, even when we have sought to just gather our experiences and write about them in a simple, straightforward narrative, so to speak, though I don't think any such thing exists. Just think of the three histories that, two histories were published by Kali, the other was published, I think, by, who published We Will Smash This Prison? Orient Black Swan. Yeah, so issues at stake and space within the struggle were published by Kali. All those were 1990 publications, whereas Gail Lombard's We Will Smash This Prison was 1980. And all these books make it very clear that whatever they are narrating as the histories of the emergence of feminism in parts of India, the story cannot be taken to be complete. They're all shadowed by other languages. And the shadow you see in all the caveats that the authors use. All these books are full of caveats. And for me, as a translator, if I am to translate any of these books today, I would also want to account for the fact, this tentativeness, this openness, how did we let it become a canon? So that it becomes a textbook where students read this and say, oh, but the women's movement then didn't do this. Where do we lose that tentativeness? Is it translation that's the problem in terms of teaching? Or what happens when this sort of tentativeness is sort of completely not visible anymore? And why is tentativeness important for us when we translate? So these are some issues that I just want to sort of talk about when we see translation as a feminist mandate. Now I just want to end with after saying a couple of things. One of the things is, I think, for the translator, and again Rita has talked about this, how do you translate embodiment? And I think for me this came through most strongly in a debate that all of us went hoarse debating, the bar girls issue in Mumbai. The issue of the bar girls dancing and whether the dance was banned by the Bombay government, and multiple feminist positions emerged. Right to livelihood was one of them, that many of the bar girls were from denotified, notified and scheduled caste communities was another. The third was nobody is asking the bar girls anything, we're all making up our minds without getting a sense of what they wish. And they were all played out in the Kolkata Women's Conference venue. Meena Gopal has written this very rich essay opening up the debate on how might we think of this. But for me the question was really the embodied experience of stigma. And I just want to take 2 minutes to share a story. Many of you are familiar with Pa Ranjit, the Dalit filmmaker. So Ranjit, in many of the cultural events that are sort of done in April to mark Ambedkar's birthday, one such event he called various, whoever was present on stage and gave them each a parai, a drum, which is usually used during funerals. Dalits are expected to play the drum in these funerals. And one very well-known Tamil Dalit young writer called Stalin Rajangam, he refused to hold it. He said, no, I can't do it. And we were sort of, why is Stalin saying this? Afterwards, he made this extremely moving speech about how his father and many others of his generation were part of the Scheduled Caste Federation, Ambedkar's Scheduled Caste Federation, and how in the 1940s and 50s, they made huge collective agitations to not use the drum. The drum would be burnt in public. And there's been this very poignant novel also on the subject by another Dalit writer, where you have this musician who plays the parai beautifully, not wanting to burn it. And anyway, so Stalin said, my father sort of made sure that none of us had the drum in our colony, but he was friends with everybody, even the caste Hindus. So when one caste Hindu family had a funeral, they had to get drummers from another village, but my father went to help. And I was taken as a child, I was 7 years old. And when the drummers came as a child, you're fascinated, it's music. So I went and sort of sat near the drummers and just touched the parai. He dragged me and slapped me so hard. I remember that slap even now. Slapped me and slapped me and slapped me till I was sort of, just screaming and yelling. He says, I can't hold this drum. So how do you capture that? And I think Meena tries very valiantly to do it through a call for debate and dialogue. But I think in caste society, which is also deeply and horridly gendered, embodiment is something that is so complex when it comes to translation. And nowhere have I felt that as when we try to see what books we would choose for translating under the Prabha Kaitan from your Northeastern catalogue. Because we were saying that everything from the food to the body to the way people look is so different. It's not simply about text. Because Tamilians, anybody who's not a Tamil, they're all Hindikars. Or they are Chinamen. That's how they make sense of the Northeast. Very benignly, but still, this is not an embodied presence that communicates something that they have always held dear, which is the right to self-determination. I mean, Tamils have always held that right as a very dear right. So they have a history that's common with the Northeast, at least in terms of ideas. And C.N. Annadurai, the founder of the DMK, followed and wrote on the Naga struggle for years. So there are ways in which you can connect. But then these stories by women are also embodied narratives. So when you bring gender into it in a way that complicates our understanding, this poses a huge challenge for the translator. What might make for a bridge in this sense? So I just want to end by citing Sharmila Rege's pedagogy, what she calls Phule Ambedkarite feminist pedagogies, because I think she opens up the whole question of rendering and translation, communication and pedagogy in very creative ways. To put it very shortly, she brings this issue up at a time, this is the early 2000s, of a crisis in the university. With a lack of merit, standards are falling. We're all familiar with this argument. But Sharmila points out that this crisis has been defined just at a time when a classroom demography is changing. When you have an unprecedented number of Bahujan, Dalit, Adivasi and minority students in the classroom. And how is merit mapped here? It's mapped onto language, onto English. Mapped onto seeing the students as lumps of clay to which you will bring a classic enlightenment focused knowledge. The classroom is not seen as a creative space which offers its own resources. The experiences of students on the one hand, and also what the English knowing student is yet to learn. So she sees that classroom as a place where English and Marathi come into very creative conversations. And I remember through the early 2000s, the Women's Studies Department creating these wonderful audio tapes, which were summaries of theoretical literature from the English. And then students would be asked to listen to these tapes and then read the English text. At the same time, there would be very fascinating student projects where students work together. So you had a student who had a lot to say about beef and what beef means to them, with a classic, either a Brahmin or a Banya student to whom any kind of meat eating is an abhorrence. So I think these ways of putting students together to work on projects which were then published, student publications that the department did, opened up ways of thinking about how do you set up conversations across contexts and cultures and so on. And I think in translation, these conversations stand to enrich what we were doing. Like for example, just a couple of examples and I'm done. Take Bama's Karukku, an iconic text. Many of us know this text. But how many of us know that Bama's text is unimaginable without a knowledge of Dalit Christianity? Not just the casteism in the church, but the enabling power of Christianity for Dalits. And I'm not sure that the translations give you a sense of that, A. B, there is no framing endeavor to make that work. And when that is not done, the text becomes so exceptional that it's removed entirely from its location in the Tamil context, A. And B, it also does not do justice to the very interesting conversations between missionaries, locals, on the question of caste, on the question of gender. And I think today, in view of all that we see happening in, say, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand, Madhya Pradesh, or even in Tamil Nadu around religion, especially Christianity, the absence of these conversations limits our responses also in some ways. And I think a text like Karukku holds the potential to carry these conversations into another way of looking at reality. So that's something that I thought would be very, very important for us to keep in mind. Likewise, another text is our own, the text that came out of Zubaan's work on impunity, Kunan Poshpara. Again, the tone is extremely sad and indignant. Do you know Kunan Poshpara? Have you forgotten? What is this amnesia? We will also have to ask, do you know what happened in Ayodhya? What is this amnesia? So we're constantly subject to this amnesia, right? And I think in Tamil, when we actually did a reading from the text, translating sections for one of our March 8th things, and an entirely new generation of young Muslim readers were struck by what they had not known. And then we went back and spoke of how in Tamil Nadu we've always been very receptive to the Kashmir question, unlike other parts of India. Some other parts of India, how Khurram Parvez was always a welcome guest on our platforms, how we've had a long history of being engaged with it simply because of our own interest in federalism and so on. So I think in a way, the way in which we also frame some of these texts becomes very important when if we want to continue to translate them into our different languages. And I want to end with something that Rita again raises in her book, which is about not just the big things, as she says, but the structure of everyday communication. How do you sort of focus on that when you translate? Whatever text it is that you're translating. The big point is one thing, but the big point is made through small words also sometimes. And how do you do that? And I think when translating, we also made history that struck me the most. Just a casual thing like 3,000 Dalit women gathered for this. That's stupendous that 3,000 Dalit women gathered to hear Ambedkar speak on education and women. And why is this not an important part of my history? But it's a fact. It's stated in and then the narrative moves on. So in that sense, how do you attend to the normalcy of these statements? Because they are not normal to those of us who are not Maharashtrian, who don't live in Maharashtra, for whom this is common memory, right? So I think these are some of the issues that I wanted to share with you, which means that, and I'm saying this also because some of us here are writers, some of us are translators, there are publishers here. What would be very useful and interesting is, and we've all thought about this in different ways, while we work on these projects, we also continuously work on something that would keep alive discussions and arguments in and through what we can call translation pedagogy. Not simply the instruments of translation, not simply about specific ways in which you translate, but these various other issues that come up because as we know in most of our languages today, a text is translated not for the reasons that I have been discussing, but also some things have become so popular that you can't not translate them. And if you don't do something, you're seen as politically incorrect, none of which comes under the feminist mandate for translation, even though we may be translating feminist texts. So you would have institutions which have nothing to do with feminism saying we want to hold an exhibition of Zubaan poster women. And I said, I'm not coming. What is your interest in feminism? Just because you know Urvashi. That's not enough. So in that sense, I feel, how might we build a community that's wider, which could include all those who are genuinely interested? I'm not against people not knowing things, but I'm certainly against people who are opportune and instrumental in the way feminism has always been instrumentalized by the state, by various players. So I will end with this suggestion that perhaps we can think through feminist translation in ways that would be consequential for us as we go forward with our labor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Geeta. This is literally a class in metacognition about translation. I would request Anindita to come and felicitate Geeta for this amazing, amazing keynote.